There's a question asked in one of the comments that I still have fogginess in my epoxy, please help. And then they go into explain what they've done. They started from an 80 grit all the way to 4,000 and then polished. And at the end, they're still getting fogginess. So fogginess in epoxy is due to having scratches in it. I believe the main problem is starting with 80 grit, and here's why. So when you pour epoxy, basically it's flat when it's dry, right? So sometimes you might have some inconsistencies and you get like a slight wave, whatever. To knock this down, it's not that exaggerated, right? So even though this looks straight, it may not be perfectly flat. When you hit this with 80 grit, this is 40 grit, you can kind of see how the sandpaper has a bunch of aggregate on it, right? It's a bunch of tiny little stones basically that's glued to this paper. And what that does is when you sand it, it creates these divots. You're removing material. Right? So all right, so now you have all these divots in your flat surface. Every time you go up a grade or down or higher the number, the less aggressive it is, right? These peaks get lower and lower, right? So you come in and you hit it with like 220, and now you get it to here, right? And then you hit it again, like 400, and you're bringing it down to here. All right, when you get into 400s, now you need to do some wet sanding. And the purpose of that's kind of double folded. One, it helps polish as well as getting all that dust, that super fine dust, out from underneath that pad, because the stuff that you're removing will also scratch the surface as well. So every time that I go down, I wipe the surface clean. So hit it with a spray bottle, just mist it with some water, and then you come in with your wet sand paper and sand. When you're done that, wipe it, spray it again with water, wipe it again. Go on to the next, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,500, and then I stop there at 2,000, and you should be almost completely gone. So you're back to a very flat surface. Now, once you're at that, you can still see some swirl marks. So then you get a polish. You got to pay attention to the cut of the polish. So there's a heavy cut all the way down to a light cut. This has aggregate in it as well. If you take it and you put it on your fingers and you smear it around, you can feel that it's rough. This is also going to cut into that material and rough it up. So you start with a heavier one, like a heavy cut. I have a 10 and I have a 5, and this is what I finished my stuff off with. I'm sure they have stuff that's better, but this works really good on my car, so I'm fine with it on the epoxy as well. And the same thing though is make sure that it's nice and clean before you go to the next step. All right, so if all that fails and you still have scratches, it's still foggy, you can do a flood coat right over the top. Nice and smooth, just a small amount of epoxy, enough to color the top, and basically start all over. And if you do that route, don't start with an aggressive grit. I would probably start at the 400 level and go from there, and just take your time. This is not a race. Every time that you do a cut step, say you're starting at 400, I would sit there and until it's nice and smooth, until you can't see any difference. The entire thing should have uniformity scratches. Once you're all done wet sanding, you wipe it off. You spray it with water, you wipe that off, and then you look at all the scratches around it and make sure it's nice and even, and it should feel smooth. And then as long as there's no differentiators, then go to the next step. But I hope that helps.